Hey y'all, can folks hear me? Okay, awesome. I think Thea's having some trouble with audio. And so Thea had asked me Kayla, if you can start and kick us off.
Yes, I can. Can you hear me? Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, whichever part of the country you are in. My name is Kayla Reed. I use the She series. I bring you greetings from Cori Bush's district, formerly known as St. Louis, Missouri. I am the executive director of Action St. Louis, which is a leading organization in the movement for Black Lives, where I also help lead the Electoral Justice Project. And it is an honor to be before you today to talk about this very exciting moment that our movement is in, that is a product of our labor over the last 7 or more years. And so I'm excited to bring you into this teaching where we're going to talk about the People's Response Act, which has been introduced and led by my Congresswoman Cori Bush. In St. Louis, we are excited about this piece of legislation. The Movement for Black Lives is excited to be partners as we pursue passing this legislation. The People's Response Act is such a historic piece of legislation that really creates a new public safety division in the Department of Health and Human Services and moves us to thinking about safety as health and wellness and well-being and actually investing into our communities, which we know is necessary. The People's Response Act was inspired by the Breathe Act, which was launched over a year ago during the 2020 uprisings, that is about investing into communities instead of the harmful practices of policing that continue to devastate our folks. And so I'm excited to be here. I hope you're excited to join. We had some technical difficulties, but I promise it's all going to be worth it. So thank you for joining us today. And with that, I will pass it to Thea.
About that. So wonderful to be with you today. Angela, are you on the line now?
No, Angela only had a short amount of time for the beginning, so she's
okay. No worries. So would love to go ahead and is Thalita? I'm sorry, is Thalita in here? Okay. All right, so we're going to go ahead. Oh, great, Thalita. Could you please take off your video, but would love to just go ahead and introduce our next speaker is Thalita. She is an extraordinary artist and poet who currently is the Civil Rights Corps poet in residence. And she has put together an original poem for all of you today, which is inspired by the People's Response Act. So without further ado, would love to turn it over to Thalita.
Thank you so much, Thea. It is an honor to be here with everyone who is in attendance. I am based in Central Texas as the poet in residence for Civil Rights Corps, but I'm also someone who has spent time in the county jail. And so to see the great work that's being done at the national level is amazing, and I appreciate it so much. This poem that I've written is called Take Me to Paradise. And that's because when I think about what the potential of this legislation is, it's for it to create paradise on a very real and very local level. And I think that's amazing. And so this is the poem, Take Me to Paradise, a poem for the 2021 People's Response Act. Paradise, where I am first a person, second a dream, the wildest one of my ancestors, and I'm thriving. Paradise, where I am recognized as someone who is loved before I am recognized as someone's lesson to be learned. Paradise, where I am more than my mistakes, more than my bad days and my hard times, where I am not confined by the outlines of this country's bad dreams. Paradise, where I am not confined. Paradise, where every fresh season, the clean streets bloom, fill with the laughter and unfettered joy of the young, old, and dreamy. Paradise, where I get to live long enough to see the young awake from their dreaming and make it all a reality. Paradise, where the jobs run free and wide like waterfalls, our wages more than enough to feed us, more than enough to clothe us, shelter us, heal us, give us our free reign of our days and nights and years and life. Paradise, where I see first the face of a healer before I see the face of a holster. Paradise, where the blessed silence of sirens and the songs of the blue jays interrupt the violent haze of misplaced anger and trivial trespasses. In other words, paradise, where I can cross any street I want. Paradise, where I can sleep in my car anytime I feel like it. Paradise, where I can love up on whoever I want. Paradise, where I can drink from any fountain, shop from any store, get what I want when I want it. Paradise, where I can sit in the shade of any tree, let my feet rest. Know what I mean? Paradise, where I can breathe. Paradise, where I can breathe. Paradise, where I can breathe. 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 I can. Paradise, where my faith in our country's greatest minds is restored. Our blocks restored, our homes restored, our land restored, our schools restored, justice restored. Paradise, where green grass sweeps through the community like an emerald sea of hope, wonder, and light. Paradise, where I don't have to wonder if my doctor sees me as a whole human being that I am. Paradise, where the health of my mind and my spirit is just as important as the health of my body and my property. Paradise, where a helping hand comes easy. Paradise, where my pain isn't buried beneath doubt, where I am believed, where I am heard, where I am protected. Paradise, where I can come up out of a cage, where I already done paid for my mistakes and find myself welcomed, given a chance to improve, given a chance to build, given a chance to try again at this difficult and confusing thing called life where nobody gets it right. Paradise, where it's easier to find a roof to put over my head than it is to find a bullet. Paradise, where I can fall asleep and know that no one is going to wake me up to kill me. Paradise, where I can sleep in peace the whole night. Paradise, where I can lay my many burdens down, be held, be forgiven, be uplifted, be encouraged, be seen, be heard, be healed, be trusted, be loved, be fed, be happy without worrying what comes next. For once, paradise, where I can breathe. I can breathe, where I am alive and protected and, like I said, thriving. Paradise. Somebody take me to paradise, because it's time for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Polita. That was so moving and so powerful. We're so grateful that you were able to share that with us today. So,
thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So always hard to move from poetry to the much more prosaic task of creating federal policy, but that is my unfortunate goal right now. And so we'd love to just take a few moments to explain to you the first major thing that is part of the People's Response Act, the first major policy within it. And then that will tee us up for our first of two panels today, exploring why we are looking for this paradigm shift to non-carceral safety and what that paradigm shift really looks like. So the first major policy contained within the People's Response Act is the creation of a sub-agency within the Department of Health and Human Services in the federal government called the Division of Community Safety. What this Division of Community Safety would do is, number one, it would coordinate research across the federal government on interventions that promote non-carceral safety, which could include policies like expanding access to treatment, and which can include investments in infrastructure like streetlights and all the other sorts of programs taking place at the community level that are really serving people and communities safe. The second thing that this new Division of Community Safety would do is it would work with state and local governments to put together grant applications that they would then use to be able to start making these investments in a big way in non-carceral safety. And then the third and most important thing that this agency would do is that it would be running a number of marquee grants that would invest in community-based organizations, and local governments, and state governments, all to drive investments in non-carceral approaches to safety. And you'll hear a little bit more about some of those specific grants from Felicia in just a moment or two. But before we get there, I do just want to quickly uplift a few things that make this new division relatively unique. So one thing is that all of the investments this new division of community safety will make will be in non-carceral approaches to safety, which means disconnected from the criminal legal system. The second thing that makes this division unique is that for the first time, the federal government will have a way to make investments in these kind of community-led approaches that aren't being channeled through the criminal legal system. You know, right now we associate so much of public safety with the criminal legal system and with the Department of Justice at the federal level. But what this new division will do is start to open that up and to locate public safety in the realm of public health. And then the final thing just to uplift about this new entity is that it would be fully accountable to a community advisory board that would be made up of individuals who are directly impacted by criminal legal harm, as well as advocates who are on the front lines fighting for change on all of these important issues and doing this work every day. And the idea is that this advisory board will monitor all of the priorities around research and around grant making to ensure that they stay accountable to the real purpose that this bill is trying to serve. So with all that being said, would love to turn things over to Josie Duffy Rice, the former president of the Appeal, a writer, an activist, and an extraordinary speaker for you guys.
Thank you so much, Thea. Can you see me? Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to moderate this panel about why we need this new paradigm for public safety. And since we're running a little behind, I'll just quickly introduce our panelists and we'll get right into it. So we have Gina Clayton-Johnson, the executive director of Essie Justice Group, which she founded in 2014 to harness the collective power of women with incarcerated loved ones to end mass incarceration's harm to women and communities. We have Alex Vitale, a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and a visiting professor at London South Bank University. You may have seen his book everywhere recently called The End of Policing. We have Maritza Perez, the director of the Office of National Affairs at the Drug Policy Alliance in Washington, D.C., where she leads the organization's federal legislative agenda and strategy. And we have LA's own Lex Stepling, the director of campaigns and policy at Dignity and Power Now. So if you all can go on to video, if you're not on video already. Do I see everybody? You might be missing Lex for the moment, so we can get started. And hopefully he will join us. Does that sound good to you guys? All right, hi, everybody looks beautiful. I'm just gonna ask you just a couple of questions in the time we have. I think all of you are so talented at talking about this and could probably talk about it for hours, but I really wanna get across some crucial points about the People's Response Act and why it's important. So Gina, I'm gonna start with you. Over these last years, you've been a central architect of the Breathe Act, upon which much of the People's Response Act is based. You've been leading both at Essie Justice Group, hi Lex, and the Movement for Black Lives, and really been driving this federal policy initiative in a very serious way. Given these experiences, could you talk a little bit about the context in which this policy sits and why you think that this paradigm shift in particular is so necessary?
Absolutely. And it's so good to see you, Josie, and everyone on this panel. I'm really excited to be in this conversation. And thank you, CRC, for hosting all of us in this conversation. You know, one of the things that I think is important is that Black people and Black movement have really paved the way for this bill. Understanding the context to any policy and the context in which it sits is really important. And this context, the context of this bill is the 7 years of Black organizing since Ferguson. It's the over 600 actions across the country, Juneteenth weekend of 2020, coordinated by the Movement for Black Lives when we saw the nation take to the streets. The context of this bill is the demands shifting, right, from mere tweaks to a system to demands that say invest in our communities and divest from systems of harm, policing, and prisons. The context here is the paltry federal legislative responses we saw adding more money to policing in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And the context is the Breathe Act, as you said, Josie, born out of the 60+ Black-led, Black-centered organizations and communities who developed the vision for Black lives through an intentional 18 months people's process. This is the context that has paved the way and made possible the People's Response Act. Why is this bill necessary? It's necessary because what this bill means is that we get closer to a reality where a cop isn't going to respond to every single issue that comes up. In our elementary schools, our unhoused communities, our hospitals, we won't constantly be seeing a person with a badge, with a gun, with tasers, fulfill the roles best performed by others. This bill has airlifted Section 2 of the Breathe Act into its policy. So it is a huge moment. It's a huge movement win to be in this place today where we are seeing its introduction. It's important because you so often, I think, hear myself and I'm sure all of you in conversations over the last year or more, you hear people throw up their hands and say, okay, I get it now. Policing is messed up, but what is the alternative? The PRA, the People's Response Act, makes it possible for us to scale and nationalize the alternative in a real way. My organization, Essie Justice Group, every year we, as Black feminist abolitionist organizers, we bail Black mamas out of jails before Mother's Day. And we've been doing that for the last 5 years in California with our partners like DPN, like Dignity Power Now, Young Women's Freedom Center, A New Way of Life, and others. And a few years ago, I'll never forget meeting a woman in jail who'd been there for months. And she was arrested because she was sleeping in her car with her child. A neighbor concerned called the police, and what resulted is that her child was taken away from her and she was put in jail. It's heartbreaking, and this happens all the time. And the PRA creates this paradigm shift. It makes it so that states, counties, and nonprofits can access federal dollars to build non-punitive, non-carceral responses in these situations and many others. And it helps to entrench and support the defund wins that we've seen organizers in St. Louis and Los Angeles, Philadelphia and Portland and many other cities achieve. I think this is important because it has national implications for the existence of non-punitive alternatives to police. Many of us are local organizers, people who are working deeply in local spaces. But the role for the federal government in this moment is exactly this, exactly what the PRA is doing, is making these options abundantly available, commonplace, and widespread across the country. And I'll just end, because I know we are short on time, and say that, we do still have work to do. I'm really proud of what has happened behind the scenes in the collaboration between Black Lives Matter and Civil Rights Corps, Essie Justice Group, and the Movement for Black Lives in working with Congresswoman Bush's office on the specificities of what this legislation has in it. This is a strong bill, but none of us believe that the Department of Health and Human Services is like this maroon space free of carceral and punitive thinking and approaches. And yet Congresswoman Bush is listening to movement in some key ways. And my personal hope is that this is something that makes it more possible for us to introduce and pass all of the components of the Breathe Act policy into law. So if you're on this call and you're an organization that hasn't yet endorsed this bill, please get on board, sign our endorsement letter, and help us push for passage.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gina. That was great and great context. Alex, I'm going to go to you. So your work is deeply grounded in the belief that jails and prisons and police are not the most effective way to keep families and communities safe. And your work has advocated the use of alternatives, including legalization, restorative justice, harm reduction. Can you explain, I mean, you've literally written the books on this, but can you explain the evidence and examples that really overwhelmingly lead you to believe that give you support for this need for a transformation and the need for a legislation like the one that we're talking about today?
Thanks, Josie, and it's such a pleasure to be on this call with people doing such amazing work on this issue for so many years, and I'm very happy to just add my 2 cents to the conversation. I think that we have to ground the answer to your question in just a little bit of history. As the academic, I'm required to give a little bit of history, which is just to say what we've done is we've systematically defunded essential social services for people across the country. We've defunded mental health services. We have failed to invest in high quality substance abuse services. We have failed to provide housing for millions of Americans. And then we have turned those problems into problems of crime to be managed by policing, with no real regard for whether or not this is actually a just, much less an effective strategy for managing what are fundamentally social problems. And this has produced the terrible dynamic we're in now, where police officers are spending their days not chasing bank robbers or finding serial killers. They're managing the lives of the most vulnerable folks in our society who are homeless, who are experiencing mental health crises, and they have the wrong tools for doing that. Between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. And the solution to that is not to give police more training or more tools for subduing people. The solution to that is to get police out of the mental health business. And that's what this bill does. We know that when we create non-police crisis response capabilities, that these are more effective than police. And we also know that police are not needed. We hear time and time again from police unions, that we can't possibly take this responsibility away from police because these are all potentially violent encounters. But if we look at what the data has been showing from places like Oregon, from Denver, from the other cities that either have long histories or more recent histories in implementing these alternative crisis response teams, we see that police are not needed. In Oregon, in the areas that have this, they divert 20% of all 911 calls to these non-police crisis response teams. And those teams request police assistance in less than 1% of all calls that they go on. And mostly that police assistance is very minimal. The recent STAR program in Denver, their initial results showed that they did not request police assistance one single time. The clinical workers, the outreach workers were able to handle a huge volume of 911 calls that had previously gone to police. Similarly, we don't need police in the homeless outreach business. We need actual outreach workers who can build relationships with people, but just as importantly, we must have high quality services in place, because outreach in the absence of services is no solution to this problem. And that's why it's essential that we have these new streams of funding to create things like supportive housing, low threshold community-based social service, mental health services, so that we can actually resolve people's problems instead of being in the constant mindset of crisis management. And finally, in the area of violence, it's become increasingly clear to growing numbers of experts that we need to understand violence as a public health problem and as a social justice problem, and policing are the wrong tool to address these problems. We need to invest in community-based solutions that have evidence behind them, that treat people with human dignity and respect, that try to break the cycle of violence. And when these programs are well funded and well run, they have shown tremendously positive results in a number of cities across the country at reducing shootings and homicides much more effectively and more cheaply than just policing. I'll just end with one little cautionary note, which is that we have to be careful that we don't turn our social service agencies into policing agencies, because too often we've seen that in the absence of real social justice, in the absence of real social services, solutions to our problems, that social workers and other non-police agencies can get pulled into that same mindset of managing people without solving their problems. So that's why it's essential that bills like this include a strong role for community-based organizations to develop strategies that they think best suit the needs of their communities. And the distributive grants that are included in this bill create the possibility for doing that. Thanks, and I hope people will get behind this bill and support it fully.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Professor. That was great. I really appreciate it. I'm going to move to Maritza. Maritza, your work has largely focused on framing substance use as a matter of public health and not something that can be solved by the criminal legal system. So can you explain a little bit more about this and how you see the People's Response Act as supporting this narrative shift?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that this bill is extremely helpful to our current efforts on the Hill. So, at the federal level, we're dealing with a very interesting dynamic, whereas I think, the public largely understands the drug war has been a failure. And we know that from every measure of polling that we've done on this issue, when it comes to marijuana, when it comes to all drug decriminalization, when it comes to the devastation brought by the war on drugs, people get that. But that still hasn't resonated with Congress or not even with this administration. And we've had various challenges in pushing forward criminal justice reform. And I'll give you guys a real life example of that. So something that we've been contending with recently is this issue of class-wide scheduling of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. Congress is still under the impression that the way to fix the overdose crisis is to criminalize fentanyl because illicit fentanyl is responsible for a lot of the overdose deaths and the uptick that we've seen in that, or at least that's the common mythology. What we've been saying is that no, actually, it's more like what Alex said, that we haven't really invested in a public health response to drug use. We've never done that. We've seen fentanyl analog bills and we've seen fentanyl criminalized across the country. At the same time, we're also seeing the overdose numbers climb. So what that tells me is that criminalization doesn't work. It hasn't historically worked. We can look at the war on drugs the last 50 years and know that that approach has never worked. But we can look at, what's happening currently around this conversation with fentanyl and the overdose crisis. Instead, we're asking members of Congress to support a fentanyl harm reduction bill. And that again is a public health approach to drug activity. So it would include things like medication assisted treatment for people who want and need it. It would include harm reduction services, things like drug checking tools, so people are able to check drugs before they consume them. But it's really, a different approach to how we have historically treated drug issues. But, I'll say that that's a really hard sell on the Hill right now. So Representative Bush is actually doing something really courageous by putting this bill out there, because it's really, really hard, and we need to build more allies around, support for public health response. And we have a lot of work to do there, because I'm telling you, on the Hill, people still don't see the public health approach as really being a public safety approach. That's never talked about. And this is one of the first bills to do that. So that is really, really helpful to what we're trying to do. And, I will add that we also worked with Representative Bush recently to introduce the first bill that would decriminalize drug possession at the federal level. And what's really important about this bill is not just that it would decriminalize possession for personal use, but that it also invests in health services. So a lot of the things that I talked about earlier, making sure that people are connected to treatment should they need and want it, but also making sure that people have harm reduction tools that we know actually save lives. Things like drug checking tools, naloxone, which can reverse the effects of an overdose, All of these things are what we should be investing in rather than criminalization. So this bill is extremely important to that narrative change. The Drug Policy Alliance is supporting it. I'm hopeful that, you know, people on this call, that your organizations will also support it, because this narrative shift needs to happen, because we're always constantly, you know, confronting a new drug that, you know, is being demonized. And right now it's fentanyl, but we've seen this before. We saw it with crack cocaine. There will be something else that comes, that Congress really attaches itself to. So this is, one reason the Drug Policy Alliance is certainly going to continue to support this bill and this narrative.
Thank you so much for that, Maritza. That was really, really helpful context, and so appreciate you being here. Lex, you are going to be last but never least. Your work at Dignity and Power Now has really put you on the ground, and you've really won some just incredible policy wins that put this paradigm shift, I think, into action, both how people think about it, but also how it actually works, right? How you can actually see how shifting resources away from law enforcement and investing in social services actually is an effective way of handling what people consider social ills. So can you explain how your work in LA has kind of created a blueprint that really inspired this legislation and the Breathe Act and so much of the work that has happened nationally?
Sure, thank you. It's nice to see everybody. And I think that, one of the first things I'll say is that so much of what we are talking about is things that have been done in the public health context for a long time, and done successfully because the logic behind it holds up in any which way you scrutinize it. And when I say it's been done for a long time, doesn't mean it's always been sustained. Often the best models are not set up to be sustained. And that's kind of, I'm getting to a point.
Lex, is he going in and out for everybody else?
Public health.
Yes.
Sorry, Lex, we lost you for a second. I think you're back though.
How about now?
Yes.
Am I back? Can you hear me now? Okay. Hopefully that doesn't happen again. Okay. All right. So I don't know where it was that I broke up, but I was saying that public health models that are based on that synthesis between the agencies and departments that are supposed to provide, in synthesis with community providers, community-based organizations, and community-based advocates, have always, the harm reduction, service-oriented, community-based model has always worked. And all the lives that have been saved have had one distinction, which is that those who were not able to kind of engage in this programming that helped so much is because they were under the so this kind of the only thing with it.
Oh man, wait, I lost you, Lex.
Yeah, I'm just gonna try to set up a better connection. Give me 1 sec. I'm so sorry.
I hope they can hear me.
We'll give Lex just a quick second before we end this panel and move on.
Okay, how's
There we go.
this?
This is great.
All right. Okay. So for the third time, basically what I'm saying is that community-informed public health models have always worked and have saved countless lives. However, there's been a huge segment of our community that's been excluded from accessing those services simply because they are under the supervision of the court system. So the court system has been this silo and a really violent one. And where this all leads is that these solutions are not novel. Framed this way, they've been treated like they're novel. conversation around defund gets treated like it's novel. We're in what, our fourth, fifth decade of Reaganomics, fourth, fifth decade of an intense austerity that has just really robbed resources from the most basic and necessary social services that everybody deserves. And the only two entities, I guess at a local level, the only entity that has survived austerity politics has been law enforcement.
Mhm.
And the not only continued expansion of funding in law enforcement, but the continued militarization of law enforcement, as well as this cynical relationship between law enforcement lobbies and politics at a federal, state, and local level to advocate for resources via harm that they've done. Oh, mental health isn't being addressed appropriately. We need to do better at that. Fund us more so we can be trained, etc. And that goes across the spectrum, even around, how do we address victims of our own violence? Let's get more money for training, etc. So we've got these bloated budgets that have enforced the ability for them to kind of exert even more of their own political self-interest, which is the only obstacle remaining. So when Maritza's talking about how there's such difficulty in getting traction on the Hill, one thing that I think happened on the ground here in LA that was useful is that we were able to authentically base build. We're from our own communities, we're building in our own communities, and we're having the conversations in really frank, open ways, which is to say things like substance use or houselessness are not as linear as people want them to be, that the solutions don't get applied in a linear way that make people feel better all the time, that we know our own loved ones, our own community members who've been harmed aren't always going to access services the way we want them to. They're not always going to stop using drugs. So our real conversation is about being safer. Our real conversation is about community wellness. And when that message was made very clear, that law enforcement is actually a huge obstacle to safety, a huge obstacle to community wellness, first of all, it's true. So it resonated. So when we did a thing like, and what I'll say is that it's always true, and that in fact, it's always popular. And the only thing that stands in the way is really faulty, broken systems like polling. The only way to truly gauge if something is popular is to look at the votes in the aftermath. So let's take two examples, Measure J in Los Angeles and Larry Krasner's bid for re-election in Philadelphia. Those are two examples, the best possible examples to look at the question of, is this a popular mandate or is this something else? Well, in both of those instances, in LA County for Measure J, 65% of the county voted for Measure J. In Philly, 65%. Krasner got more votes his second election than he did the first election. And this is after a year of an onslaught of, propaganda in the form of, the tough on crime style propaganda that they're regurgitating from the 80s and 90s, the Willie Horton style politics, as well as like what Maritza said, the hysteria around drug use that has a new iteration over and over again. And these come from the fact that, for example, the LA County Sheriff's Department here in Los Angeles has a communications budget of $24 million a year. That communication goes into this propaganda that we're constantly fighting. But what's interesting is that it doesn't actually work. The popular mandate continues to be on the side of divesting from law enforcement, investing in community-based solutions, because that's actually what the community knows keeps us safe. And so we won based on that, essentially saying this is what the community wants and you can't disprove it because we've mobilized numbers. And the only thing standing in the way at this point, I think everybody has done such amazing work. The logic behind the drafting of this legislation has all been so strong and all rooted in experiential knowledge of what we see works. The only thing left in the way is the political self-interest of law enforcement and the fact that they have a well-funded lobby, well-funded comms, the ability to kind of present an onslaught. The other obstacle is the will of the judiciary, state by state. Judges tend to collude with law enforcement. And then the last thing would be that elements in the mainstream media project their own discomfort, their own alienation from the community, their own fear, and want to assume that actually we do need police. And what you're saying is that you might feel more comfortable with police because you might represent a point of view that's not actually indicative of the majority of people nor the communities that are impacted. And so that permeates a little bit. So we don't have the clarity of narrative that we deserve. But even in spite of that, I just cited two examples where 65%, I mean, that's beyond a landslide, and it'll happen again, and it'll happen again, and it'll happen again. And so representative democracy in a certain way is failing us right now because of the political, I think, inertia or the political discomfort or the relationships folks have with law enforcement lobbies that just have so much money. But as far as what's popular, I do think it's just really important to declare with a lot of clarity that we're winning in LA because it's popular. We're not tricking folks into anything.
Right.
It's just, it's an overwhelming onslaught of popularity that people are sick of living a life where their daily lives are encroached upon by state violence and want to have access to the services that everybody works to have. So, and, you know, there's often a desire to replace one bad system with a system that, you know, let's speculate might be better. And sometimes we do need to do that, but often what we're doing is replacing it with nothing. And sometimes the imagination, the political imagination we need from folks is to imagine the absence of something, because that's actually what safety looks like for so many people. So I'll stop there. And I know I had to come in and then there were some tech issues, but I wanted to respect whatever time I have or don't have.
Thank you. I could really listen to all four of you talk all the time, because everything you said really, really resonates, I think, definitely with me, I'm sure.
Oh no, now it looks like maybe we lost you, Josie. But maybe it's a good time just to pass it back over to Thea in the next section of this agenda, investing in non-carceral approaches to community safety. Thea, I don't think I can hear you. Maybe others can, but no, seeing some head shakes.
With the audience.
I can go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that. Hey, Felicia.
Yeah. Hey, y'all. I'm Felicia. I work at Essie Justice Group. I'm the Senior Policy Associate, and I'm going to run us through this next section so I can just go ahead and jump in. But huge gratitude and appreciation to all of the panelists. It was really incredible just to hear about these new visioning for public safety, right? And how we really position that in terms of our thinking about the People's Response Act. And so for my section here, I want to go a little bit into some more of the substance of the People's Response Act, specifically those 4 new grant programs that this act would create that do exactly what our panelists were talking about, which is to build out this new paradigm for public safety, specifically through an investment lens. And so if we look into the nuts and bolts of what that specifically means, each of these new grant programs is awarded by the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, which is really this reshifting of how we see public safety, community safety in the United States as more of a health-centered lens instead of a carceral and punitive lens. Additionally, each of these grants, which would provide much needed resources for the non-punitive, non-carceral investments that genuinely keep our communities safe and align with community needs. And so I'm going to go a little deeper into what are each of these 4 grants, so folks have a little bit more understanding and understanding really of the substance of the bill language. So one of the grants would be eligible for community-based organizations. And really the funding for these grants can go towards any purpose that has a demonstrable connection to improving community safety. And by that, we mean specific programs like crisis intervention that do not rely on police or any type of carceral actors, violence and abuse interruption and prevention programs, implementing public health activities and expanding access to voluntary health services. It could also include things like housing security programs, support for youth and families, support for victims, re-entry support, in addition to capacity building for local advocates and community-based organizations, among many, many other things that can go towards community-based organizations. And I want to just also note here that the language drafted in this section was really intentional to ensure that we know that a lot of times federal funding is very inaccessible to smaller, more grassroots community-based organizations. And this language is really drafted through a lens of how can we make this funding most accessible so that smaller, more grassroots community-based organizations and community leaders have access to funding to sustain programming that they already may be doing that's really incredible, or to create the innovation and thinking behind building out and sustaining new programs. The second and third grants that come out of the People's Response Act are grants that go towards state and local governments. And they essentially have similar purposes of really trying to incentivize state and local governments to research, fund, and support innovative approaches to community safety. And the fourth grant in the PRA is the First Responder Grant Program. This is a competitive grant program that would be used to really hire and train first responders. And I want to just know, I know a lot of us can go to the thinking of, oh my gosh, a first responder as a police officer initially, but the language is very clear here that this would not include any type of law enforcement officer and be completely disconnected from law enforcement as a whole. So what we're really saying when we say this first responder grant program, we're thinking of licensed therapists, psychiatrists, doctors, nurses, teachers, mentors, people that we know and have seen through our own work locally in our own communities should be the people that are responding to crises in our communities. And who would be eligible for these grants is really a wide array of actors. It could include community-based organizations, it could be health departments, states, local governments, tribal governments, as well as a wide array of private and public entities. And why are these grant programs so important, right? I kind of went into the nuts and bolts of really what are these grant programs. And the reason why these are so important is one, it provides the vital funding mechanism that we need to sustain and build out the infrastructure that we have dreamed of, specifically through the Movement for Black Lives Breathe Act and the Vision for Black Lives policy platform, which is where the language comes directly from in some of these bill sections. I also think that it's so important as we think about the divestment work that's happening all across the country, where we've seen localities and states divest from policing. The PRA holds the line here on the investment portion of this divest invest work, right? While we're divesting, we also need to be thinking up and building out what are we actually investing in? What do we actually need and want in our communities? And a lot of this investment through the grants here are really funded through community needs as identified by the communities themselves. And so with that, I will go ahead and pass to Monifa Bandele with Movement for Black Lives.
Thank you so much. And I think we're going to start first with Leah. Are you there, Leah? Okay, we're going to go to Leah for 2 minutes and then start our panel.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. My name is Leah Sakala. I'm a Senior Policy Associate in the Urban Institute's Justice Policy Center, and so appreciate this conversation, and it's an honor to be here. I've been asked to very briefly share some of my work related to community-driven safety strategies as framing for this conversation. And really the most important takeaway echoes what you've already heard, and that research is clear that our safety and well-being is inherently linked to our access to resources, connections with those around us, and ability to meet our basic needs. And of course, we all know this intuitively through our own experiences also. We also know, and research affirms, that addressing harm, including violence, is really complicated and contextual, and that strategies need to be tailored to specific communities and informed by deep local knowledge in order to work. And even some of the most well-known and documented strategies, like, for example, cure violence, have worked better in some places and situations than others. But the great news, as you're hearing today, is that communities around the country are deeply engaged in this work, and that there are really promising models and examples that we can learn from and adapt. So making sure that we're talking to one another and documenting and sharing successes and challenges is a critical part of the solution. And the second thing I'd like to mention as framing for this conversation is that collaboration and coordination across sectors and across levels of government is also key. So of course, lots of the most direct public safety work can only happen on the most local level, and I'm talking, of course, the neighborhood level here. But other players, including the federal government, absolutely have a role to play in supporting the shift to think about and build public safety differently. And actually really excited to be sharing this space, particularly with Fernando Rejon, in part because he and I, along with another colleague, actually recently released a paper looking specifically at the role of the federal government can play. And this question is important because traditional federal funding and policymaking related to public safety has really focused primarily on punitive reactions to crime rather than holistic responses to harm. And that has, as we've heard, created a whole host of associated consequences. And then at the same time, many of the people who are on the ground doing critical safety work outside the legal system face chronic challenges meeting their community's needs in a sustainable way with really limited resources. And so in this paper, based on our research, we propose that deep federal investment in collaborative local public safety infrastructure is a critical part of starting to grow and strengthen some of the promising community-centric approaches. And just to clarify, by infrastructure, I mean, of course, financial resources, but I also mean access to relationships, physical space, and leadership roles in public safety planning and coordination. And this is because really, regardless of the model or community, the top priority needs to be ensuring that the people who are closest to public safety challenges, including the harm associated with traditional legal system solutions, are at the center of conversations about what we should do instead. So I'll pause there because we have some wonderful additional speakers to learn from, but thank you so much for being part of this important conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Leah. And I also want to underscore thank you to Civil Rights Corps for hosting us on this platform. I want to bring in 3 panelists to open up this discussion. I'd love to have both Amber Pyatt, Rukia Lumumba, and also Fernando Rejon to come off of their video mute. And we have some questions for you to really contextualize what we've heard so far. So Amber, I'm actually going to start with you. Your Health Instead of Punishment initiative is seeking to transform how we approach safety. Much of the People's Response Act does. Can you briefly explain this initiative and how you view this bill as supporting that effort?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Monifa. And thank you to all organizers of this panel. I'm really honored to be here. And thank you also to all the practitioners and advocates and organizers who are doing the critical work to make our communities safer and healthier. So as Monifa mentioned, I work with the Health Instead of Punishment program at HIP, or Human Impact Partners. We are a national public health organization headquartered on Ohlone land in Oakland, California. And we really seek to transform the field of public health to center equity and to build collective power with social justice movements and campaigns. And at HIP, I lead our Health Instead of Punishment program, which is really trying to push for racial justice, health equity, and community safety in partnership with those who have been most harmed by the criminal, legal, and immigration systems. So I want to quickly touch on 3 things ideally today. One is just the state of public health research on these issues. 2, a little bit about how HIP approaches this work. And finally, a word of sort of paradoxical caution. So first, the public health research. So public health research is actually very clear. Policing, incarceration, and state surveillance all measurably harm individual, family, and community health. If you are interested in diving into that research, I would advise that you read the American Public Health Association, or APHA's, policy statements on police violence and incarceration, which really clearly lay out the problems as well as evidence-based abolitionist solutions. And I'll drop some links in the chat to those and to some other things after my remarks. And I don't want to fall into the trap of being overly formalistic about what is public health research and what is not. And I certainly don't want to relegate knowledge creation to, fancy researchers with prestigious titles. Directly impacted folks sharing their truths in whatever time, place, space they find appropriate is valuable and valid data as well. So, the stories we read online, the experiences of family members of those who have been murdered by police, the chorus of chants we hear in the streets to address racism and policing as public health crises, these are all part of the public health evidence we're talking about here too. So taken together from the ivory tower to the streets, we're in a moment in history where the demand for public health approaches to community safety is now clearer, more widespread, and more undeniable than ever. So given all that, at HIP, we know that no one strategy or one tactic will get us to a world where all people are healthy and free. So we really take a multi-pronged approach to our work around increasing community safety through non-carceral means. That includes conducting research in partnership with grassroots groups on issues like pretrial incarceration, school policing, direct ICE transfers. We also work with public health departments to transform their institutional practices and policies to center racial justice. And in addition to that direct client work with departments, we also release concrete guidance on things like addressing police violence and supporting decarceration efforts. We also engage and mobilize public health workers, mostly through our National Public Health Awaken network. And finally, we really try to create political education and narrative change offerings as well. So the last thing I want to say is just, you know, as a public health worker myself, I feel I have to be the one to name that the field of public health is not perfect. Health sectors have absolutely perpetuated harm and upheld structural anti-Blackness, racism, transphobia, ableism, xenophobia, and other forms of oppression. Even in HHS today, we know there are problems. We need to look no further than the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, which is responsible for supporting unaccompanied youth. So all of those things are real and true. And we know that the People's Response Act will create a division of community safety in HHS, which we fully and wholeheartedly support. We know that this is not a be-all, end-all. This will not single-handedly address all the struggles our communities face, but it is one step in the right path. So this is really a both and situation. Yes, we think that the People's Response Act is critical and the right move. And yes, we will need to hold that division accountable if and when it becomes a reality. So passing bold legislation in that way is not dissimilar from electing bold leadership. As advocates and organizers, we have to hold their feet to the fire to ensure that we get the goods we're looking for. And I'm so honored to be part of the team that will hopefully get us there once this legislation is passed. So thank you so much, and I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Amber. It reminds me of a lot of what Lex said. You know, we have to change the overall narrative too and continue to build that power on the ground. Speaking of on the ground, my next question is for Rukia Lumumba, who is also a leader in the movement for Black Lives and heads up the People's Advocacy Institute. Rukia, your work has put you directly on the ground, helping communities to develop alternative responses to crime and safety generally. That work is more important now than ever. Can you talk about that work briefly and how you view the federal policy as linking back and supporting this very important local work?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Monifa. Thank you, everyone, for having me, for including us here. I am based in Jackson, Mississippi, with the People's Advocacy Institute, where similar to all across the nation, we've seen a spike in violence during COVID, right? Violence in many forms. But also physical violence, gun violence, violence that is caused by many health conditions that we're talking about right now. And so some of the responses that we've been using are really responses that are centered in community. So at the People's Advocacy Institute, we really focus all of our efforts. We're considered an incubator for transformative justice in the South. And so all of our efforts are really centered around how do we ensure that we are allowing community, not allowing, but raising and centering community as not only the identifiers of what the problem is, but also the ones that provide the solutions. And so the PRA, what it does is it really invests funds into community. We believe that community is central, not peripheral to system change. And so what we've done is look at models that have existed across the nation for years that have been very successful. And so we're looking, for example, at the Cure Violence model that looks at violence as a public health epidemic, right? Looking at it as a disease. So looking at the Cure Violence model, prevention is a unique model that stops the spread of violence by using the methods and strategies associated with disease control, detecting and interrupting conflicts, identifying and treating the highest risk individuals, and changing social and community norms. We've seen in places where violence interruption programs have been implemented, also known as cure violence programs, we've seen a decrease in violence, and specifically gun violence, by up to 70%. 70%. Treating it as a public health epidemic, a public health problem, not something that is just about policing. We also look at national models such as the Credible Messenger program. This is an approach that is a movement and an approach that really sits in the core belief that communities have within themselves transformative resources to lift up justice-involved people in a comprehensive and positive way. It works from what we consider the inside out, with young people and folks that have experienced incarceration and at a higher risk of reoffending. And they're matched with specially trained adults with relevant life experiences, often people who are also incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, who we call returning citizens. And they're considered credible messengers, and they share their background and improve outcomes for young people in the justice system. And so what we've seen is increased engagement with programs and services. We've seen a reduction in rearrests and violations and a new found belief and love for people's self. We've seen an increased compliance with court, and we've seen improved relationships between system stakeholders and community members. Using the Credible Messenger model in many places throughout the nation, but specifically in New York, you've seen a 50% decrease in felony arrests from those in the program, 30% less likely to be arrested than their counterparts. And we've seen a 76% reduction in gun homicides. So these are things that are not only showing good results, but they're coming directly from community. These are programs that are run by community members that have actually experienced the very harm that we are trying to prevent, and the very harm that many of us have relied too long on police to solve. And so, like we heard Professor Vitale say, that we need to really get police out of the youth development business. We need to get police out of the mental health business. We need to get police out of the parenting business. We need to do what they're doing in places like Wisconsin with Freedom Inc., where they have coaches and they have case managers that help people get into safe places who are engaging in domestic violence. They don't rely on police. Instead, they rely on other community members that have experienced that and have that wealth of knowledge. And so what we see with the PRA is that it invests the very dollars that we need in our local jurisdictions to see the change that we need. Many of these programs run off of a shoestring budget.
Yeah.
They are a lot less than any other system partnership, such as a carceral system partnership with the youth court or prison, so forth and so on. And so we want to see that money directed back into community, into community programs, into people who actually can solve the problem that we are trying to address.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that expertise from Jackson, Mississippi, and how it connects to this federal work. And last, but definitely not least, our final panelist, Fernando Rejon. You've been a leader in supporting on-the-ground violence interruption programs that have impact every day, exactly what Rukia just described. Can you explain how programs like yours work to keep people safe and model the kind of non-carceral approach that Leah described?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invite to Civil Rights Corp. Good to see you, Leah. She's a great research partner. And a shout out to Danny Zamora from Crossroads, who'll be speaking in the next panel. Well, my name is Fernando Rejon. I'm the executive director of the Urban Peace Institute. We're located in Los Angeles, California. We implement violence reduction strategies and smart justice solutions to end violence and mass incarceration so communities can thrive. So our work is not only in the LA region, but we work with cities across the country to provide technical assistance and training to help develop community-based strategies to ensure community-based public safety. So a lot of our work, and I'll break it up into 3 areas that we're focused on right now. So one is the first is the ground level expertise, right? So gang intervention workers, street outreach workers, violence interrupters are folks with lived experience, people who many times come from a gang background or formerly incarcerated, who go out as peacemakers. They're trained and certified as peacemakers to engage young people in the community, and not just young people, anyone that has the potential to commit acts of violence, in order to provide alternatives to violence, to de-escalate tensions, and to get in between the conflicts that are happening. Many times, sometimes physically, but many times really going through shuttle diplomacy and setting up understanding between groups or neighborhoods that are having disagreements or in conflict. So that's a very important role as we are looking at reimagining public safety and broadening our understanding. The mere enforcement of laws alone does not generate safety. The narrative around public safety has been dominated by law enforcement for a long time. What we're doing is we're expanding that narrative and saying, look, if we're going to shrink the impact of the footprint of the criminal justice system and mass incarceration, we need to build a parallel economic infrastructure and a community-based public health and safety workforce that allows communities not only to survive, but to thrive. And so as we shrink those dollars, and we talk about divest, invest, we're divesting from systems that perpetuate that oppression and invest in building out economic infrastructures for communities to thrive. And so when we're pushing for a community-based safety workforce, gang intervention across the country has been pivotal to that. So in LA, for example, over the last 10 years, we've been below 300 homicides, which is 300 too many. I think the lowest we got to in the last decade was 254. Dramatically different than in 1992 when there was over 1,000 homicides in the city alone. However, that's still not good enough. We want a vision zero. Unfortunately, in 2020, like cities across the country have experienced, we saw a spike. It was the first time we were above 300 in a decade. But now we need to double down on the strategies, not only in LA, but across the country. And the White House is listening. The White House yesterday launched the Community Violence Intervention Collaborative, focusing on 15 cities where they're going to invest federal funding. Now, the groundwork is an important piece. In LA, for example, when LAPD alone responds to a gang-related homicide, the chance of retaliation, of a homicide retaliation, is 24%. When LAPD plus gang intervention in their separate lanes respond to a gang-related homicide, the chance of retaliatory homicide drops to below 1%. It drops to 0.7%. Over the years, gang intervention has been credited with reducing violence in LA by 42%. We know this stuff works, and it's not only LA, it's Chicago, it's Oakland, it's New York, it's cities across the country that have demonstrated when you invest in community-based public safety strategies, violence goes down. And that's an important piece. As we've seen during the pandemic, the public health gaps have been exposed, but also you see the impacts of gun violence as we reckon with the history of American racism. The confluence of those three things have really exposed what we've known for a long time, and now folks are paying attention. So imagine we look at violence as we look at the pandemic, the virus outbreak, right? So it's really changing the frame and the values of a country on how we invest and reinvest resources and not continue to sustain the criminal justice system that has, long impacted our communities. I'm gonna skip 2 and I'll go to 3. Number 3 is advocacy. We are part of the LA Violence Intervention Coalition, 17 frontline gang intervention agencies that are working on the front lines in the heart of the peace movement in LA County and LA City. We launched the Fund Peacemakers campaign, and we've raised over $20 million to be invested in this work, both in the city and the county. We are also partnered with folks up and down the state of California for the Fund Peace California campaign and the CalVIP Coalition, which raised $200 million from the state to invest in these programs. And we're advocating for more. We're also part of the National Fund Peace campaign that's advocating for the $5.3 billion proposed by the Biden administration to invest in this work. So the difference with this advocacy, and folks say it all the time, is that the people that advocate for this work don't necessarily see those funds. We need to change that. So with the advocacy platforms that we build, we make sure that intervention workers, practitioners, people on the front lines can meet directly with decision makers and say, this is what we need, this is why we need it. And they can hear the passion, but they could also hear the rationale for why this works. And that's different. And then that needs to happen more and more, and they need to benefit from that advocacy. Now I'm gonna go to number 2, and for us, this is where the rubber meets the road, is that when we create funnels of federal dollars, public dollars, even philanthropy, the funnel has to touch the ground. If it does not go to some of the smaller based, community-based organizations, we're not doing our job. we need to create infrastructures. The challenge is when dollars go to the federal level, they go down to the municipalities, and then we have to beg and argue and fight with the county, the state, or the city, say, please release this money, please release this money. What we're looking at is standing up intermediary organizations to go directly after federal funding to funnel it down to community-based organizations. So we are looking at a tiered system where a certain amount has to go to smaller community-based organizations under 500,000, the next tier 500 to $1 million and above, and then above 2 million, just to make sure that there's equity in how those dollars are dispersed. In the smaller community-based organizations, though, they also need capacity building and administrative support. And so there needs to be tailored capacity building for the smaller organizations to build up their capacity, because they have what we call the license to operate at the community level. And they can reach the most vulnerable populations that many times just are off the radar and not civically engaged. So our work in LA and across the country is to advocate for dollars to come down, to make sure they touch the ground, and to make sure that the community-based public safety infrastructure, whether they are community health workers who are engaging as working as virus interrupters that are engaging the community, passing out PPE, public education, vaccination information, or if they're street outreach workers that are interrupting violence and providing alternatives to violence and saving the next generation. The work that we do here and across the country, I think, is critical during this time. People are listening. And like I tell the brothers and sisters in LA and the ones across the country that we're connected to, if we don't do it now, it's not happening. Let's go.
Let's go, let's go. Thank you so much, Fernando, for your leadership and also for the amazing work of the Urban Peace Institute. Invest all the way down to the community level on the ground. We cannot underscore that enough. So now we're going to shift over to our next spotlights. Danny Zamora, who was already mentioned, come off muting your camera, from SoCal Crossroads, and then followed by Pamela Purdy from Precious Blood Ministries will be our organizational spotlights. So I'll hand it over to Danny.
Well, here it's about to just barely turn afternoon, but good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having Southern California Crossroads and the invitation. I'm so excited. I'm very encouraged by hearing so many people. It's such a great team. We got people working in the White House all the way down to the actual ground, which I think it's an amazing type of work that is being done. So what we do here in Southern California Crossroads, we are out of South Los Angeles, and we cover Compton, Watts, and Willowbrook. What we do is we provide prevention services focusing on youth from the ages of 10 to 15 who maybe their siblings, parents are involved in gangs or risky behavior. We provide case management, intervention, and we approach it in a strength-based approach. Say the family tree. We're not just looking for someone, because a lot of the people we service come from broken families, so we're trying to strengthen their their emotions and whatnot, their relationships. And so we provide prevention services through case management. We also provide intervention, and intervention we deal with crisis response. We talked about public safety. A lot of the things that we do is we're definitely public safety. Law enforcement, what they do is they're a reactive way of doing work. We're a proactive. So when there's a homicide out on the ground, yellow tape goes up, the coroner comes out, and then when the tape comes down, what happens after that? That's when intervention comes in. Intervention is there when the actual incident happens. We respond, we work with families, we work with community. We understand that the trauma is not only the victim itself or the family, but it's a community as a whole. So we approach everything in a community aspect. Not only that, but we work with obviously the gang members, providing jobs, providing solutions, all types of things that they may need to kind of make their life just much easier. And then at the same time, being able to communicate and create those networks of lines of communication to be able to diffuse retaliations or any thing that may be brewing up within Los Angeles itself. We also provide safe passage. We work with local parks, local schools to provide safe passage in the mornings and in the afternoons. We actually provide staff members to be out there and just helping, the community, ensuring there's no fights, making sure that if there's something brewing, then we're there being reactive and being accessible to the community itself. We also provide, it's called hospital-based violence intervention. So these folks, we provide that intervention in St. Francis, UCLA Harbor, and we're also in talks of new hospitals that we're going to be expanding to. But what we do is we provide case management at bedside assistance. So if an individual comes into the hospital, we're able to connect with them, we're able to connect with their family, and we're able not only to, help them with the trauma mentally, right, through mental health issues and stuff, but being able to provide services such as victims of crime that the family may not know about or may not be open to, because if they see a certain individual, some people judge us, right, by our looks. So intervention is so so vital that, when somebody that comes in looking a certain way, they may not be open to, but when intervention comes in, doors are open, opportunities are open for those that we're servicing. So, we provide prevention, intervention, safe passage, and hospital-based intervention. So I'm very excited about this whole work that is being done holistically, not only here in LA, but all over our country. And here's another thing, guys, is that not only are we, not only is violence coming down, but we're able to employ people from our grassroots communities, our intervention workers, our case managers. All these folks are from the community that we're actually servicing. We're not bringing outside entities, outside people. We are getting people that are from the actual community, and we're empowering them to give back into the community. Maybe at once they were the folks that were causing the problems, and now they're back into the community creating solutions. So I think it's an amazing work. And so once again, thank you so much for joining us and allowing us to be here. Pamela, are you here?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, beautiful. Well, thank you everybody first for having me here. I feel like I learned so much from everybody. You're doing some great work. I guess I'm here to talk about Precious Blood, PBMR, Precious Blood Ministry of Reconciliation. I'm coming to you from Chicago, Windy City. We are a restorative justice hub. There are 9 hubs in Chicago throughout the city. You don't hear a lot about the hubs. I know you hear about all the violence and the gun violence, but there are hubs in different communities taking care of the community. The way we take care of our community is restoratively. First of all, we serve young men 14 to 21. And to keep it real simple and short, we take gangsters from the street, introduce them to a passion for a year, a little over a year, maybe. They work with us in different passions that they may have throughout our programs. And then we give them work outside of the community. We have culinary, studio to make rap videos, garden, wood shop, t-shirt business where they're making t-shirts and sweatshirts for companies, pottery, and so on and so on. But we're doing this restoratively by building relationship. I'm listening to a lot of things being said about people coming together, working with people, but we invest in relationship with everyone. We have a mother's program for mothers who've lost children to gun violence and have children incarcerated. And sometimes it's both in one family. So how do we support those mothers, and how do we support our young men? By enhancing the relationships around them, by using restorative justice practice. It's a philosophy, it's a way of thinking. We train, my job as the coordinator, restorative justice coordinator, I'm a trainer of peace circles and other restorative practices, and I'm the coordinator for the whole program. My job is to create and enhance relationships, because the more I know about you, the least likely I will harm you. And that is a firm belief in how we work. I've trained over 100 and some police officers, and out of that group of officers, we have circle keepers. And that's only because they want to know how they can relate with the people or the individuals in the community. If I'm coming from the north side of Chicago, but I'm policing on the south and west side with mostly people of color, probably don't have an interest in your well-being. I'm just there doing my job and might be doing it poorly. So what we do, enhance that relationship, not just with the police, with the pastors, with the schools, with the people in the community, so that they can have an interest in the community being safe. Okay, we are trying to show that if I'm not safe, no one's safe. If you're not safe, I'm not safe. So we're bringing people together. We're working with people. And we're enhancing the relationship. So our young men, some have cases, some are coming back from jail, some are arrested with mostly a lot of gun charges. They're encountering the police on a daily basis. They're African-American men, they're Latino men, that's a daily thing for them. So how do we come in restoratively and work with that? We found that restoratively enhancing those relationships and bringing people together, we sit in circle a lot. People, young men are put out of school. The school don't suspend them, don't throw them away. We go to that school and we have a peace circle around why, what is happening? What do you need? How do we make this right? Not who needs to be punished. Same thing with judges. I work with restorative judges, judges that have gone through the restorative practices and trainings. A judge called me and said, I don't believe this person should be incarcerated. Can you do a circle around this or that? And so I'll either do it in the restorative justice courts, or I would do it here on our premises. But we handle things restorative. It's not about what rules were broken, who should be punished. It is what happened, who was involved, who was harmed, and how do we make this right? And we've been in existence for quite a while now. I've seen a lot of young men, women too. We have a young women's program as well, come and go. But the biggest issue has been people in their own community not having a relationship with the systems and the people that are governing over them. We can easily say, I don't want to deal with them, I want to get rid of them, I want to walk away, but then nothing changes. And so the biggest part of my work is making sure that I bring people together that is involved in the community. It's kind of like we adopted the whole community. Restoratively, we handle everything that comes in the community. Now, the best part about bringing community folks together and enhancing the relationship with each other, where you know your neighbor and you care about your neighbor, then if someone is trying to steal my grandson's bike, or there are worse situations in the community than that, I don't have to call the police. Then I have a relationship with you now, and there's a group of us that understand what this means to come together in circle and talk about it and talk about my fears and what I need. So working in a restorative justice hub means just that. I am enhancing the relationship. I am bringing people together. I am helping people to help themselves have an interest in each other, including our young men. They come from different gangs and they come from different neighborhoods, but mainly from this neighborhood, but there's always tension between the people in the neighborhood. It's bringing people together so that they can learn how or start to take an interest in each other and rely on each other. I hope I made sense.
Great. Can everybody hear me? I'm hoping so.
Yes.
Okay, great. Panelists, would you just mind, if you are available for the Q&A, could you just pop off your lack of video? That'd be great. So we do have a few questions that have come in via the Q&A feature. If you have any additional questions to add, then please go ahead and submit them. Would love to get those answered. So with that being said, would love to go ahead and start off with a question that I'm going to throw at Amber. And the question is from Jim, and it is, are any folks here working on how we message justice-oriented policies for public safety? It feels like we need a clear messaging framework akin to the Green New Deal to cut through the noise and effectively respond to the attacks from the right.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are so many messaging resources. We have an abundance of riches in that sense, and are working actively on creating some of that collateral for this bill in particular, for the People's Response Act. One resource I'll just drop in the chat is some resources that Human Impact Partners put out on why policing is antithetical to public health, especially during a pandemic, as well as why decarceration is actually critical for advancing health equity and public health, in particular during a pandemic as well, which we continue to be in despite what some news sources say. And so I'll drop those in the chat, and please make sure that you're on any like listservs and mailing lists, et cetera, so that you'll get the messaging specific to this legislation as well.
Great. And any other panelists want to chime in on that question before we go to our next one? Say, Lita, as our poet, I don't know if you have any words of wisdom from a messaging standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that what is going to help, I think, legislation pass is obviously making sure that the community is deeply involved with what's being said, and involving artists is one way to make that happen. Involving your local writers to participate and write the op-eds, inviting the people who have stories to tell, getting those filmed and shared across all platforms, I think is really important. Social media is a tool that I think is making the big difference for all of us. You know, I've been sitting here sending messages in Twitter and Facebook and Instagram because I know just how important it is to reach all of the platforms. So, I mean, I know that many of us are already involving artists, but the more you involve them, the easier it is to translate the policy and make it easier for regular folks to understand. So that way they can have that conversation on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, that's my comment.
Great. Anybody else who wants to get in on this question? If not, I will tee up our next one. All right. So our next question, I'm going to kick over to Fernando. And the question is, how do you see the community violence intervention effort by the federal government intersect with the People's Response Act? And what do we need to do to influence CVI?
Good question, and thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, there's multiple bills that are out there. I think, so Susan Rice convened the meeting yesterday where we had White House representatives, we had funders from across the country, we had actually some mayors of major cities, and then we had a lot of our colleagues, the practitioners, the people that are advocating strongly for this work. I think it's really, there's also has to be a connection, I think, with different advocacy collectives that are working across the country. So as I shared, we're part of the National Fund Peace campaign, right? I think having conversations to kind of link advocacy efforts is critical. I think there are, you know, of course, there's so many people advocating, so many different advocacy organizations and groups. They're not necessarily connecting, right? I know with Fund Peace, there's a major focus on making sure that it's led by people of color, that dollars are going to communities of color most impacted by violence. And I'm sure that aligns with the PRA. But I think really building stronger coalitions and broader coalitions, I think, are key. You know, I think advocating, from what I read from the PRA, advocating for those dollars, really to expand public safety and make sure that it's not just going to law enforcement, and ensuring that there's a broader understanding of what we mean by safety, and really changing the narrative, I think is critical. So I think reaching out to different coalitions and building those relationships and pushing in the same direction is really going to be critical. These multi-ethnic coalitions, I think, will go a long way.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Fernando. So our next question is shifting a little bit to how this work intersects with the international system. And so I'd love to just throw this open to anyone who would like to chime in. And the question is, how can we best use the new report from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on harsh law enforcement focused on Africans and people of African descent? Does anybody have thoughts on that? If not, I'm also happy to share a few ideas.
Well, I was interested in this focus. I think that I'm always constantly thinking about how migrant detention is connected specifically to mass incarceration. And right now, 50% of, well, not 50%, approximately 44% of the people who are in migrant detention are of Haitian descent. And if we start understanding that when we talk about policing, we're not making America hospitable to other folks and framing it in that way is like, this is not a welcoming place for anyone, then that is another conversation, another layer of the conversation that can be had. And so I think that that's one way to integrate that report into grassroots organizing, is saying, how are we welcoming people who are visiting family members, or how are we welcoming people who are wanting to grow here in America? And how is that related to how we're responding to incidents? We're talking about different people's cultures and how they respond to, emergency incidents that are happening in their communities or happening in the communities they're visiting. And so that's another side of that conversation.
I mean, the war on gangs and the war on drugs, the strategy here in the country has been exported to cities or countries, across the world. And I can speak specifically to Central America. And I know El Salvador, they're looking at trying to change the frame around policing, easier said than done, given the history. But they do have some opportunities there, given the police forces that started in '92 is up for retirement, and really retraining officers on what the framework is. And, as the United States, goes through, American policing is in a crisis nationally. And so this is the opportunity to change the mission of American policing. And as we change the mission of American policing, other countries will follow. So for us, the international work is important to support, but the work here, I think, with our communities, with the agencies here to transform the us versus them mentality, the warrior mentality of policing, is critical. And it's gonna happen in a lot of the larger cities, because that really sets the tone for a lot of American policing.
Yeah, that's great. And I love the way you kind of highlighted the intersection between some of the work that happens around gang violence in the United States and in other countries, and just all of those sorts of connections that are so important to interrogate. Just one point to add, because she did have to hop, is that last summer, Gina Clayton-Johnson, who spoke earlier on a panel, actually did a briefing on the Breathe Act for one of the UN commissions, and that was used as part of the development of some of the reports that they were doing about the issue of police brutality. And so that just shows kind of like a very clear way that there is definitely space for advocates to engage with these bodies, to put forward not only their perspective on the problems being faced in this country, but also on visionary solutions for how we address them. And that comes full circle because, of course, many of the ideas in the People's Response Act are actually based on the exact ideas that Gina was speaking about at that briefing about a year ago. So then I think we'll just do one more question for folks. And if you do have additional questions after this, I know there's a few we're not going to have space to get to, then please feel free to follow up with us via email. But let's do this will be a good one to end on. So there was a question here, which is addressing the issue around, all of the attention around rising rates of crime in communities and the way that that is playing out in the media as well as in various legislatures across the country. And so we'd just love to hear really from kind of a cross section of panelists, because I think you probably all have something to say about this, but like, what is the best way to uplift this message around non-carceral safety at a moment when there really is this national conversation happening, both about crime patterns and of course about issues that we have with law enforcement? So who would like to kick that one off? The $1 million question. Any volunteers?
I have no problem volunteering. Maybe
right.
people with thoughts. I mean, the news is about storytelling, and we know what the real stories are, and we have access to the people with those stories. And so I don't know if that means making it more of a priority to tell our stories in a regular, consistent way across the nation. I don't know what that looks like. I know that there are a couple of initiatives with people trying to work on anthologies and work on panel discussions and things like that. But I can't bring my neighbor to a panel discussion. For the most part, they're not going to show up. As much as I want them to, they're not going to show up to that. But they might check out something on Netflix, or they might check out something on Facebook. And so just making it accessible for us to continue talking about what good things are happening in the community, and making that a priority. I really love what Ella Baker Center does with National Night Out for Safety and Liberation, which is just a time for us to talk about what does safety look like in our communities when it's not involving police. But what does that really look like? And having that visual and then having that night designed to embrace like what the community could look like, if we had that proper resources for it, as something that helped to transform me and something that I know helped to transform the other people in my community. So I would be very interested in seeing what a cohesive coalitional experience, like Fernando was explaining, what a coalitional approach might look like.
Just to add, I think what Leah said is right on. We have to change the narrative, right? Law enforcement has this tremendous narrative generating machine. We see it across the country, up and down California. We're having those conversations. The truth of the matter is no major police department has really been defunded. LAPD, they took $150 million away, but they got it back and then some in other ways, whether it be in raises and other pay. I mean, even the Biden administration is proposing like $350 billion for law enforcement across the country. So it's a false narrative and it's used to instill fear, but the narrative is that crime is going up because law enforcement is being quote unquote defunded is not true. But it's a powerful narrative because it's based on fear, very Trumpian. And so that is part of the narrative that we're countering. And it's not even like we don't want to counter it, we want to create and generate the narrative. And I think having the resources and abilities, having a communication strategy, having coalitions, having people write op-eds, be out there in front and really push this narrative hard is the change. I think what's different than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago is social media. And where people go to social media for, it is a very powerful platform to utilize. And we have a young progressive generation that knows how to utilize that as a weapon and how to create narratives that can really shape social policy. And so as we shape social policy and we shape the narrative, there goes the values. We have to shift the values of this country to begin investing in the people that didn't matter before. And so now we're at the point where we're not going to step back. We have to push our narratives. We have to speak with conviction. We have to support one another. We have to collaborate. We have to leverage power, particularly, and I'll talk about our field with the gun safety folks, Everytown, Gifford, Brady, that have a lot of power around this gun violence. Is how do we leverage their power to support community violence intervention efforts that have been overlooked for a long time? And also make sure that there's space for folks with lived experience and that people of color can be front and center in these conversations to shape where this goes. And for me, it's part of that powerful time.
Great. Thank you so much, Fernando. Any final thoughts on this question or any of the others? If not, then I will close things out. Great. Well, thank you to everybody for coming, for staying a little bit of extra time because we did get started a little bit late. We will absolutely be sending out a recording of this entire event to all of the folks who registered, and we will be including in that a few calls to action for everybody who joined us today, including endorsing the bill, signing a petition to support the bill, as well as joining a sign-on letter from the advocacy community. So thanks again to everybody and have a wonderful rest of your Friday.